I stood on the porch, shivering, clutching the handle of my suitcase like it could somehow anchor me to the ground. The porch light above buzzed faintly, casting a pale yellow glow over the concrete steps. Behind me, my car sat alone by the curb, the back seat crammed with everything I owned. I had driven 8 hours straight, chasing the only hope I had left, my Uncle Calvin. When the door finally creaked open, I almost cried from relief. But the second I saw his face, tight-lipped, eyes narrowed, I knew something was wrong. He didn't greet me. He didn't step forward. He just stood there leaning against the doorframe like I was a stranger selling something he didn't want. "Hey," I said quietly, forcing a smile. "It's me, Ava." "I know who you are," he muttered, glancing behind him like someone was watching. "What are you doing here?" I hesitated. I needed a place to stay for a few nights. I don't have anywhere else to go right now." His jaw tensed. "You should have called." "I didn't think you'd say no," I replied, my voice cracking. "You always said, after everything with Grandpa, that I had family here." That's when he said it. "Only family stays here. Not you're not welcome. Not I'm sorry. Just those 4 words, calculated and cold like I was a stray asking for scraps." I stood frozen. It took me a second to even process what I'd heard. He wasn't just rejecting me, he was erasing me. Like I wasn't part of this family at all. Like the years I spent helping Grandpa after his stroke, sleeping on hospital chairs, driving him to appointments, meant nothing. "I am family," I whispered. Calvin's eyes flicked to the side again. "Not anymore." Then, without another word, he shut the door in my face. The sound of the lock turning was louder than the rain that had started to fall. I stood there for a moment, blinking in disbelief. I wasn't sure what stung more, the rejection or the way he didn't even try to soften the blow. There was no goodbye, no hesitation, just a locked door and a message I'd never forget. I walked back to my car in a daze. The rain picked up, cold needles against my skin. I threw my suitcase in the back and crawled into the driver's seat. I didn't even turn the engine on, just sat there, staring through the windshield as the water streaked down the glass. I had nowhere to go, no one to call. My phone battery was at 3%, no charger, no Wi-Fi. I was 25 years old, alone in the world, rejected by the last person I thought I could count on. I curled into the back seat, using my coat as a pillow. The car smelled like old fast food and exhaustion. I stared at the ceiling and tried not to cry. But tears came anyway. Hot, quiet, angry. How could he do this to me? What happened to family? What happened to loyalty? At that moment, I made a silent vow. I didn't know how or when, but I would never beg again. Not for love, not for shelter, not even for acceptance. I would never let someone shut a door on me like that again. And one day, Calvin Monroe would regret ever doing it. Because no one forgets the night they slept in their car outside the house they used to call home. 3 months before that night on the porch, I was sitting in a cramped hospital room, spoon-feeding my grandfather applesauce because his hands wouldn't stop shaking. My grandfather, Eli Monroe, wasn't just my last living relative. He was my compass. After my parents died in a car accident when I was 14, he was the one who showed up at the foster hearing. He didn't ask for permission, he just said, "She's coming home with me." And that was that. I lived with him from high school through college, and though we had our disagreements, I never forgot how fiercely he protected me when no one else did. So when I got the call from the hospital saying he'd had a stroke, I didn't hesitate. I quit my part-time job in Raleigh, packed up my tiny apartment, and moved back across the state line to take care of him in his house. House that also happened to be legally owned by his son, Calvin. At the time, Calvin was too busy with work to visit. He sent flowers once. Meanwhile, I was wiping drool off Grandpa's chin, adjusting his oxygen tube, and battling the deep loneliness that came with watching someone you love slowly disappear behind failing muscles and fading memory. And yet, I didn't resent it. Not then. I saw it as an honor to return the care Grandpa once gave me. He had taught me how to drive, helped me pay for my first laptop, and showed up to every school awards ceremony in a pressed shirt and polished shoes. In return, I cooked his meals, managed his prescriptions, and listened to his war stories even when they started looping on repeat. When Calvin finally showed up at the hospital 2 weeks in, he acted like some sort of savior. He swept in with that overconfident grin and expensive leather shoes, nodding at nurses like he ran the place. He gave Grandpa a 5-minute pep talk, then pulled me into the hallway and said, "You've done enough. We'll take it from here." I stared at him, stunned. "We?" He shrugged. "My wife and I. We'll hire someone. You should focus on finding work or getting your life back." But Grandpa had made it clear. He didn't want strangers in the house. He wanted me. I was the one he trusted, the one he called for at night when the nurses scared him, or he forgot what year it was. He even gave me durable power of attorney, which Calvin didn't hide his bitterness about. Still, I didn't push. I stayed. I made things work. When Grandpa passed away peacefully in his sleep, I was the one holding his hand. And yet, at the funeral, Calvin stood front and center like the grieving hero, delivering a eulogy filled with platitudes and half-truths. He was a man of integrity, Calvin said, voice cracking on cue, a family man, always took care of his own. I stood in the second row, my hands trembling with anger. I had taken care of him, but no one seemed to notice that. After the service, I tried to speak with Calvin to ask what would happen next, about the house, about my place in it. He waved me off with a rehearsed smile. "Let's talk next week, Ava. For now, let's focus on mourning." Mourning? I'd been mourning for months, but I nodded and gave him space. Because even then, I still believed he would do the right thing. That, deep down, Calvin was still family, and family looked after each other. What I didn't know was that behind the scenes, he was already redrafting the deed, securing legal control over the property, and quietly preparing to make sure I had no claim, emotional or legal, to the home I had sacrificed everything to protect. Looking back now, I realized the betrayal didn't happen when he shut the door on me. It started long before that, with every fake smile, every avoided call, every silent step he took to erase my place in Grandpa's life. By the time he said, "Only family stays here," the decision had already been made. He just needed me to believe it was mine. After Grandpa passed and the funeral buzz died down, I expected things to settle. I thought maybe Calvin would finally see me, not as a burden or a placeholder, but as someone who had held our family together in its most fragile hour. I'd been hoping for some acknowledgement, some conversation, maybe even the chance to stay in the guest room while I figured out my next steps. But what happened next made it clear. I was invisible. Calvin didn't just ignore me. He rewrote history to exclude me. A week after the funeral, I returned to the house from a grocery run and found my name removed from the emergency contact forms taped to Grandpa's fridge. My belongings had been moved to a single box in the corner of the garage. The spare bedroom, the one I had lived in for months, was suddenly Susan's new craft room. No one said a word. Not Calvin. Not Susan. Not even their teenage daughter, Ella, who used to sit with me at breakfast and ask about my college life. They acted like I was a long-term guest who had overstayed her welcome, as if grief came with a timer and mine had expired. I applied for jobs online from the corner of the living room. Calvin would walk past, pause, and say things like, "Still looking, huh?" Or, "You should consider something simpler. Maybe retail." It wasn't just rude, it was condescending. Like I was some lazy 20-something riding the coattails of family pity. And yet, I stayed quiet. I tried to be useful. I cleaned the kitchen, organized paperwork, even helped Susan set up a virtual account for her Etsy shop. Every time I did something, I hoped it would earn me just a sliver of grace. But all it did was make me easier to dismiss. They didn't want to help her. They wanted someone who knew her place, and mine was clearly not in their picture. I overheard Calvin on the phone one night talking to someone about, how hard it is to house people who can't stand on their own 2 feet. He didn't say my name, but he didn't have to. His words hit like a slap. It wasn't just that he thought I was weak, it was that he wanted others to believe it too. One night at dinner, Calvin went on a rant about young people these days, lacking initiative. I sat there in silence as he joked about kids who think babysitting a sick old man makes them saints. Susan chuckled. Ella stared at her phone. No one looked at me. I wasn't just being excluded, I was being erased. And the more they treated me like I didn't belong, the smaller I started to feel. I began second-guessing myself. Maybe I had overstayed. Maybe I was being ungrateful. Maybe they were right, and I was just someone trying to cling to a legacy that wasn't mine. But deep down, I knew better. I knew the hours I had spent holding Grandpa's hand while he wept from confusion. I remembered the nights I sat awake counting his breaths just to make sure he didn't slip away in silence. I knew what I'd sacrificed: my job, my security, my social life, and the comfort of having a home of my own. No one saw that. Or worse, they saw it and chose not to care. And that's what makes an underdog. It's not just about being powerless or poor. It's about being invisible to people who claim to love you. It's about giving more than you have and still being told it's not enough. It's about being the person who's always there in the background and then being blamed when you dare step forward. I was the girl they pretended didn't exist. But I wasn't going to disappear. Not forever. They could silence me, undervalue me, even kick me out. But one day, they were going to have to look me in the eye again. And when that day came, I wouldn't be the quiet girl in the corner anymore. Just when I was starting to think I had overstayed, that maybe I should pack my things and leave quietly, Calvin surprised me. One morning, he knocked on the door of the laundry room where I'd set up my temporary workstation. I was halfway through typing up a resume, half expecting him to scold me for using too much Wi-Fi. Instead, he leaned in and gave a tight-lipped smile. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe you could stay a little longer, just until you find a job." I blinked, stunned. "Really?" He nodded, arms crossed. "I mean, I'm not heartless. I know it's been tough. And it's what your grandfather would have wanted, right?" His voice dropped when he said that last part, like it was some rare moment of humanity peeking through. I felt a flicker of relief, maybe even gratitude. It had been weeks since anyone in that house had acknowledged my grief, let alone my efforts. For the first time since Grandpa passed, I felt like I could exhale. That afternoon, I unpacked a few of my clothes. I cleaned out the closet in the guest room, which had recently been stuffed with Susan's leftover crafting supplies. I even texted a couple of friends, saying maybe things were turning around, maybe staying had been the right choice. That evening at dinner, Calvin asked if I wanted to come with the family to a community event at the local park. I politely declined, not wanting to push my luck. He smiled again, oddly warm. "No worries. We'll bring you back something." Susan even nodded, her usual icy silence briefly replaced with what almost looked like tolerance. For a moment, it felt like the edge had softened. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee for the house, and opened my laptop to check in on some job leads. There were no snide comments from Calvin, no dirty looks from Susan. I went for a walk around the block just to clear my head, and when I returned, I paused by the front steps and looked at the house, the one I'd cleaned, protected, and mourned in for months. It didn't feel like home, but it no longer felt like enemy territory either. Maybe, just maybe, they were realizing my worth. Later that day, I overheard Calvin on the phone, talking to someone about renovations. "We'll finally be able to fix up that back room, maybe turn it into an office or workout space." I smiled to myself, thinking he was talking about the laundry room I'd been using. Maybe it was a sign that he was giving me the space to work, to grow. Maybe I had earned it. That night, I came home from a library job fair, hopeful, exhausted, but encouraged. There were a few promising leads. I imagined telling Calvin, maybe even thanking him for his change of heart. But as I walked in, I noticed something strange. The guest room door was shut. When I opened it, The room had been emptied again. My clothes, neatly folded, were now back in the same cardboard box I'd pulled them out of 2 days earlier. Sitting on top was a manila envelope with my name written on it. Inside, a typed note. Ava, I hope you understand. This just isn't working anymore. You'll need to make other arrangements by the end of the week. Best, Calvin. There was no signature, no mention of everything I'd done, no thank you. Just sterile words and cold punctuation. I stood there, clutching the paper, unable to breathe. The false hope, the warmth at dinner, the small talk, the offer to stay. It had all been calculated. A delay tactic. A way to make me think I was welcome, so I wouldn't fight it when he finally pushed me out. Maybe he was waiting until the right legal documents came through. Maybe he just didn't want to look like the bad guy too soon. Whatever the reason, the message was now loud and clear. I wasn't part of this family. I was a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed, and any hope I had held on to was gone. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just walked outside, sat on the porch steps, and stared at the sky turning red with sunset. It wasn't just the loss of shelter. It was the reminder that people can fake kindness just long enough for it to sting more when they take it away. But if Calvin thought I'd fall apart quietly, he didn't know me as well as he thought. Because something in me had snapped. And that snap wasn't the sound of a heart breaking. It was the sound of a fire starting. I didn't sleep much after reading that letter. My body was still, but my mind wouldn't stop moving. It circled around one word. Understood. He hoped I would understand. Understand what, exactly? That after giving up my life to care for Grandpa, I was no longer welcome in the only home I had left. That this man, my mother's brother, my godfather, someone I once looked up to, had tossed me out like a forgotten suitcase. That family was something he used as a label, not a promise. There's a point in grief where sadness morphs into clarity. That was the night I reached it. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to wait until the end of the week. I wasn't going to give Calvin the satisfaction of watching me tiptoe out with my box of belongings. I would leave that day, on my own terms. I packed silently while the house was still asleep. Every zipper felt like a small rebellion. I folded Grandpa's wool sweater and placed it in my duffel bag, the one he wore when we watched football on Sundays. I took the faded Polaroid of us on the fishing dock and slid it into my wallet. Everything else, I left. Clothes, shoes, dishes I'd bought for the kitchen, all of it stayed behind. I was almost out the door when I heard footsteps. Calvin. He stood at the top of the stairs, his hair still messy from sleep, holding a mug with number 1 Dad on it. "You're leaving already?" he asked, voice low and unaffected. I stared at him. "That's what you wanted, right?" He gave a tight nod. "It's for the best. Susan and I talked it over. This house, it's complicated with too many people. You need space. We need space." Space. As if I had been the one crowding them. As if grief, responsibility, and loyalty were messy things they didn't want cluttering their lives. "I gave everything I had to take care of him," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was calm, steady. "You didn't even show up until after his 3rd week in rehab, and now you're acting like I was just some squatter." Calvin sighed and took a sip of his coffee. "This doesn't have to be dramatic, Ava. Let's not make this into a thing. You're still young, resilient. You'll figure it out." There it was again, that condescending smirk, that tone of someone who didn't just think he was right, but righteous. I looked at him one last time. "Grandpa would be ashamed of you." He didn't flinch. He just said, "Grandpa was a sentimental old man. And sentiment doesn't pay the bills." That was the last thing he said to me. I walked out the door, pulled the box from the garage shelf, and loaded everything into the back seat of my car. No one followed me. No one offered help. No one cared. I drove for hours with no destination, just away. Away from that house. Away from that betrayal. away from the people who wore the title of family like a costume they could shed when it became inconvenient. I parked in the lot behind an old gas station just outside of town. It was quiet there, tucked between a wooded fence and a storage unit. I leaned the seat back and stared up at the ceiling, trying not to cry. This wasn't just about being kicked out. This was about everything I thought I knew about loyalty, shattered. It was about being discarded by the very people who were supposed to protect me. I wasn't homeless because I was irresponsible. I was homeless because someone else decided I didn't belong. And that kind of betrayal doesn't just leave you hurt. It makes you dangerous in the best way. Because once someone takes everything from you, they forget something vital. Now you have nothing left to lose. And that's when the real story begins. The first night alone in my car didn't feel real. I parked in a grocery store lot under one of those dim, flickering lights, the kind that buzz overhead like they're reminding you how exposed you are. I double-checked the locks, then triple-checked. I curled up in the back seat, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to pretend it was just a temporary thing. Like I was camping. Like I'd wake up to a warm breakfast and a real bed and people who cared. But the truth was loud in the silence. I had no one. I had no siblings. My mom died when I was 14, brain aneurysm. My dad followed her 6 months later in a crash that should have taken me too, but didn't. Calvin, her brother, had been the one to help me survive those years, or at least I thought he had. Now I realized he hadn't saved me. He'd tolerated me, and only when it was convenient. I kept thinking about how cold his eyes were the morning I left, how he hadn't once said, "I'm sorry." Not even a fake apology, just that I'd figure it out. Like being kicked out with nowhere to go was some kind of character-building exercise. I sat there in the back seat with a blanket over me and my duffel bag pressed against the window. My stomach growled. I hadn't eaten since morning. I didn't even want food. I wanted warmth. I wanted safety. I wanted someone to call me and say, "I heard what happened. Come home." But no one called. No one even knew I was gone. That was the worst part. Being erased so completely that your absence doesn't echo anywhere. The only person who might have noticed was already buried under a patch of grass and a marble stone. I stared at the roof of the car for hours, eyes wide open, just listening. To the wind, to the occasional car rolling past, to my own breath as it got tighter and tighter in my chest. It wasn't fear I felt. It was something heavier, something deeper. It was the realization that I didn't belong to anyone anymore. That night, I didn't cry. I wanted to, but the tears never came. There was too much stillness inside me. Like grief had drained every emotion but one: determination. Because here's the thing. When you're that alone, when you've been discarded like trash, something either breaks in you or builds in you. For me, it started building. Brick by brick, layer by layer, a resolve began forming. I wasn't going to be one of those people who vanishes quietly into a statistic. I wasn't going to spiral into despair and wait for someone to come rescue me. I was tired of waiting, tired of hoping, tired of begging for space in lives that didn't want me. I pulled out my journal from the glove box, a cheap, spiral-bound notebook with only a few pages left. I flipped to a blank one and wrote 2 words: "Start here." Then I listed what I had: a car with half a tank of gas, a charged laptop, 1 duffel bag of clothes, Grandpa's old watch, a head full of skills no one had bothered to notice. And below that, I wrote a question. What would Grandpa do? The answer was simple. He'd build. He'd get up, dust off, and get to work. He always told me, when the door won't open, build your own damn house. That night, under that flickering parking lot light, I didn't fall asleep. I planned. I mapped out steps. I found free Wi-Fi outside a 24-hour cafe and looked up local co-working spaces. I bookmarked a few real estate listings, cheap, forgotten properties around the edge of town. I scribbled down ideas for things I could offer: services, freelance work, anything. I didn't know what would come of it, But I knew one thing. I would turn this car into a war room, and I would make Calvin regret ever closing that door. Not with screams, not with revenge, but with success so undeniable it would slap the smug off his face without me ever raising my voice. In the dead quiet of my exile, I found something precious. Not anger, not sadness, but purpose. And nothing is more dangerous than a woman who finds her purpose after everyone gave up on her. The morning after I mapped my war plan in that journal, I drove to the library to use their Wi-Fi and charge my laptop. I hadn't showered. I wore the same hoodie from the night before, pulled tight over my head. I hoped no one would notice me. I was invisible again. But this time, I didn't mind. I needed silence, space, and Wi-Fi. I opened my email, half expecting nothing but spam and rejection letters. Instead, there was a message in my inbox titled, Ava, from Miles Ramirez. I froze. Miles Ramirez had been Grandpa's lawyer and longtime friend. I had met him only once briefly at the hospital when he came to check on Grandpa's medical directive. A kind-eyed man with salt and pepper hair and a voice that could disarm a bulldog. I remember him squeezing my shoulder and saying, "You're stronger than they think." I clicked on the email with shaky hands. Ava, I just learned you're no longer staying at the Monroe residence. I wasn't aware things had become complicated. There's something I've been meaning to share with you. Your grandfather left a private file with me to be delivered under very specific circumstances. I believe those circumstances have now arrived. Let me know when we can meet. My office is open anytime. Miles. I reread it 3 times. The words made my heart race. Something I've been meaning to share with you. Left a private file. Specific circumstances. Was Grandpa protecting me from beyond the grave? I responded immediately and asked if we could meet that afternoon. Miles replied within minutes. Of course. 3 p.m. 214. Jackson Avenue. I borrowed the library's public restroom to freshen up, washed my face, combed my hair with my fingers, changed into a clean black turtleneck from my duffel bag. It wasn't glamorous, but it was presentable. I told myself, you are not a beggar. You are a businesswoman in the making. At 2:58 p.m., I pulled into the parking lot of a small tan office building with a crooked sign that read, Ramirez and Wyatt LLP. My hands were clammy. My heart was thudding. Miles greeted me with the same warm smile I remembered. He waved off pleasantries and got straight to the point. I'm going to be honest, Ava. Your uncle thought you were gone. He thought he'd buried every legal tie you had to the family name. But he didn't know what your grandfather had been doing behind the scenes. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside were legal documents signed and notarized. Grandpa had transferred majority shares of Monroe Development Group to me 3 months before his passing. Not to Calvin, to me. I stared at the papers like they were written in another language. Miles leaned forward. He told me, if Calvin ever disrespected you, if he ever made you feel small, then this would go to you. That was the deal. He knew Calvin, Ava. He hoped for the best, but planned for the worst. I sat there stunned. But he never told me? Why? Because he didn't want to burden you. He knew if you had to prove yourself, it needed to be on your terms, not through guilt or obligation. Miles explained that while the company had been inactive for some time, it still held valuable real estate assets, properties with untapped development potential. Grandpa had intentionally held onto them, waiting, trusting that I would be the one to carry them forward. I could barely breathe. In one moment, I went from homeless to holding the keys to an entire company. It didn't feel like luck. It felt like a quiet kind of justice. Miles didn't offer empty sympathy. He offered strategy. He told me about a few local business incubators, gave me names of people he trusted, even offered to connect me with a woman who ran a women-owned construction firm and might be open to partnership. You don't have to do it alone, he said, but you do have to decide. Do you want to prove Calvin wrong, or do you want to prove yourself right? I left that meeting not just with a file of paperwork and possibilities, but with something I hadn't felt in weeks: belief. Belief in my worth, belief in my ability, belief that the world hadn't completely turned its back on me. Sometimes it only takes one person to change the direction of your life, not someone who pities you, but someone who sees what's in you before the world does. Miles Ramirez wasn't just a lawyer that day. He was my lighthouse. And now I had a map, a mission, and a second chance. The day I left Miles' office, I didn't drive back to the grocery store parking lot. Instead, I drove to the far end of town and found a 24-hour diner that let me sit in the corner with nothing but a cup of black coffee and free Wi-Fi. No one asked questions. No one cared that I was quietly building an empire in a booth with cracked vinyl seats. That night, I laid everything out: the company documents, the list of property holdings, the suggestions Miles had made. My laptop became my battleground, my journal, my command center. I knew I couldn't announce what I had. Not yet. Calvin still thought I was living out of my car, pitiful and powerless. Let him think that. Let him stay blind. I set up a new LLC immediately, Monroe and Company, Holdings, a clean, professional brand using the foundation Grandpa left me. Miles helped me file the paperwork. We changed the company address, updated the board members, which was just me for now, and activated the dormant business account that had been sitting with a small but untouched reserve. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I started small. The first property in the portfolio was a rundown duplex on the east side of town, a relic from one of Grandpa's old investments. Calvin had completely ignored it, probably assuming it wasn't worth the effort. But I saw opportunity. With a bit of vision and hustle, I could turn it into something. I took free online courses on real estate law, development, and design. I learned how to read zoning codes. I cold called local contractors for quotes. Some didn't return my messages, others tried to overcharge me. I watched hours of YouTube videos on home inspection walkthroughs, budgeting tools, and interior renovations, and through it all, I stayed quiet. I couch surfed twice, once with a kind girl from a women's entrepreneur group I'd joined online. I took freelance editing gigs at night and wrote content for small business websites just to keep gas in the tank. Every dollar mattered. Every connection counted. During the day, I made visits to the duplex in old jeans and a hoodie, pretending to be an assistant for the real owner. It was safer that way. People talk differently to you when they didn't think you were in charge, and I used that to gather information, pricing, and strategy. In the background, I reconnected with a contact Miles had recommended, Nina Hollis, founder of an all-female real estate project called Found Her. She wasn't just sharp, she was fierce. She heard my story, skimmed the documents, and said, "You have fire. Let's teach you how to wield it." Nina became a mentor. She introduced me to her network, contractors, investors, even a branding consultant who helped me design a logo and website for Monroe and Company Holdings. We worked late hours in co-working spaces, breaking down deals, learning investor language, polishing my pitch deck. The growth wasn't flashy. It wasn't fast, but it was real. I got licensed. I filed taxes under my new company. I even hired a virtual assistant to manage my inbox once it started flooding with inquiries. And the whole time, Calvin didn't suspect a thing. To him, I was still the girl who got kicked out. He didn't see the business cards being printed. He didn't hear the conference calls I was leading. He didn't notice the contractors I'd started working with to develop Grandpa's properties. Land he assumed was his birthright, but now legally sat under my name. That was the most powerful part of it all. The silence, the invisibility that once broke me, had now become my shield. Let them think I disappeared. Let them believe I failed. Every day they ignored me was another day I could build without interference. Every time Calvin bragged about how he handled the family situation, he tightened the noose he didn't even realize was around his own neck, because while he boasted, I was preparing. While he coasted, I was rising. And when the moment came, when the world would see what I'd built, there'd be no warning. Only cameras, only a contract, only the truth in black ink that said, this house, this land, this company. It all belongs to her. Not because it was handed to me, but because I built it when no one thought I could. While I was quietly building Monroe and Company holdings in borrowed spaces and secondhand shoes, Calvin Monroe was doing the exact opposite. He was basking in his own delusion. From what I gathered through Miles and a few mutual contacts, Calvin had convinced himself he was the rightful heir to Grandpa's legacy. He had already started planning renovations on Grandpa's house, the same one he kicked me out of, talking about tearing down walls and turning the upstairs loft into a home office. He referred to it as his property in phone calls and community events. The most ironic part? He thought he was being respectful. "He's even naming a garden bench after Grandpa," Miles chuckled during one of our calls. "A garden bench, Ava." While I worked 16-hour days drafting property proposals, Calvin was handing out flyers at a Chamber of Commerce mixer for his new company, Monroe Legacy Developments, a total branding ripoff of the name I had already filed legally. But he had no idea. He made public posts on LinkedIn about honoring his father's vision and preserving family values through modern development. One post featured a photo of him standing in front of Grandpa's old workshop, arms crossed, captioned, "Where it all began, honoring my roots." I wanted to scream. He was rewriting history in real time, and nobody was correcting him. He looked like the grieving son turned visionary entrepreneur. Meanwhile, the person who had sacrificed everything, the one who had held Grandpa's hand during his last breaths, had been erased from the narrative. And worse, I knew he believed it. Calvin didn't see me anymore. He didn't think about me anymore. To him, I was just a phase, a temporary disturbance, like a thunderstorm you wait out from your porch swing. He believed I had disappeared quietly, the way unwanted people are supposed to. And because I hadn't fought back, he assumed I had given up. That assumption was his biggest mistake, because Calvin stopped watching, stopped questioning, stopped protecting his blind spots. He believed his status in the community made him untouchable, that his business degree and polished charm were enough to outpace anything I could possibly do. He said things like, "Some people just don't have the drive to succeed." I heard that one through a family friend who mentioned it casually, like he was just being honest. What Calvin didn't know was that I wasn't chasing drive. I was already moving, already operating. The duplex I had flipped quietly sold to a boutique design firm for nearly double the renovation costs. I reinvested every penny. I signed 2 new property deals. I started appearing, anonymously, on real estate panels hosted by Nina, sharing my early-stage startup journey without revealing my name. I started building a portfolio that spoke louder than any resume ever could. And all the while, Calvin sat on his porch sipping whiskey like a king, holding a crown that was about to crumble. He even started pitching to investors. That's when Miles stepped in, with the most delicious twist of fate. Calvin was applying to develop a tract of land he didn't realize he no longer controlled. One of Grandpa's holdings on the west end of town, officially under Monroe and Company Holdings, with me as sole owner and CEO. He submitted architectural renderings. He made calls to contractors. He even booked a photographer to document his before and after journey, complete with a ribbon-cutting ceremony plan in the works. All of it was built on air. I asked Miles, "Should we stop him?" He smiled. "No. Let him keep walking. The longer the runway, the harder the crash." So I stayed silent. I watched as he climbed his imaginary ladder, every step a little cockier than the last. He told Ella's college counselor that his company would soon double in size. Told Susan's friends at brunch that he was the one who kept the family legacy alive. Told investors that Monroe and Company Holdings had backed out of the region and there was room to dominate. It was surreal. Watching someone walk into a trap you didn't even set, one they built for themselves. He mocked me to mutual contacts, joked that some people are built for hard decisions and some people are built for sympathy. One night, he reportedly laughed over drinks with a developer and said, "My niece? She's probably still living out of her car." He said that while sitting on a porch built by the hands of the woman he cast aside. That statement got back to me, and I wrote it down. Not because it hurt, though it did, briefly. I wrote it down because I knew I'd use it. Not in revenge, in revelation. Because soon, Calvin Monroe would see the car he thought I lived in, parked in front of a property with my name on the deed. And the only thing louder than the silence that followed would be the sound of his ego collapsing. By the time Calvin started planning his ribbon-cutting event, I was 3 projects deep into Monroe & Company Holdings' revival. My company had officially acquired 2 duplex renovations, a repurposed commercial storefront, and, quietly, the deed to the land Calvin thought he was about to redevelop. Every contract, every listing, every move was under my name. And still, Calvin was clueless. That wasn't by accident. It was strategy. See, Calvin never did the grunt work. He sent people to handle things, delegated blindly, assumed everyone was beneath him. So when my name began appearing on property documentation, it was in legalese he didn't bother to read. When city records updated the land ownership, he skimmed the email notification without processing what it meant. He assumed no one had the power to push back. But he forgot that legacy doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the person who shows up when no one else does. And I showed up. Now, it was time to show him. It all began with a harmless-looking letter delivered to Calvin's mailbox. A black envelope, gold-embossed seal. No return address, just the initials MCH for Monroe & Company Holdings. Inside, a formal invitation. You are cordially invited to a private stakeholder event hosted by Monroe & Company Holdings. Date, Saturday, 10 a.m. Location, 18. Whispering Pines Drive, Grandpa's property. Occasion, site dedication and private investment tour. Media representatives and strategic partners will be in attendance. Please arrive promptly. Dress code, business formal. Calvin must have thought it was from an outside firm, maybe one of the new developers moving into town. The name looked vaguely familiar, but not enough to register. I had made sure of that. My branding was sleek, modern, corporate. Nothing about the invite screamed me. The address, though, that got his attention. 18. Whispering Pines Drive, Grandpa's old land. The very site he thought he was reclaiming with his flashy new Monroe Legacy developments. He must have assumed the event was being held for him, or by someone trying to partner with him. Either way, he RSVP'd yes. Miles confirmed it with a smirk over the phone. I could barely contain my nerves when I heard. It was finally happening. The stage was being set, and Calvin had no idea he wasn't the main character. Over the next 5 days, my team worked in silence but with precision. We posted temporary signage at the entrance of the site. Property of Monroe & Co. Holdings. Private event in progress. We set up a white event tent with folding chairs, a modest sound system, and a printed banner with our company logo. Simple, clean, unmistakable. I booked a local press photographer. Not a big outlet, just someone to document the day in high resolution. I wanted images that couldn't be ignored. Calvin's face, frozen in real time, when the truth clicked. I asked Miles to deliver the opening remarks. He was known in town, respected. When he spoke, people listened. And I made sure the first guest to greet Calvin on site wasn't me, but a contractor he'd tried to hire 2 weeks earlier, the same one who told him the lot was pending paperwork. Let Calvin connect the dots slowly. Let him stew in confusion before the full reveal hit. The night before the event, I couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from focus. I laid out my black pantsuit, polished my shoes, and packed a single item in my handbag, the letter Calvin had left on my boxed belongings. You'll need to make other arrangements. I didn't need it for revenge. I didn't even need it for closure. I just wanted to hold it one last time and remember who I'd been the moment he decided I was disposable. That version of me, the girl in the car, shivering, abandoned, was gone. Tomorrow I would stand where I once begged to belong, but this time I wouldn't knock on anyone's door, because I owned the key, and the house, and the name on the sign. This wasn't about revenge. It was about remembrance and legacy. Theirs was built on entitlement. Mine was built on sacrifice. And by morning, the world would see the difference. The morning of the event was crisp and quiet, the kind of early autumn day where the sunlight doesn't burn, it glows. I arrived at the site just after 8 a.m., wearing a tailored black pantsuit with subtle gold accents that matched the company's branding. My hair was pinned neatly, my face calm. Not a single tremor in my hands. The tent was already set. My assistant had arranged the chairs in clean rows. The sign above the entrance read clearly, Monroe & Co., Holdings, Site Dedication and Private Investment Tour. Beneath it was our new tagline, Built from Honor, Grown with Purpose. It was more than a slogan. It was a declaration. I checked the microphone. I flipped through my speech notes. I didn't need them, but I liked knowing they were there. By 9:40 a.m., the first guests began to arrive. A few local investors, a retired professor from the college Grandpa used to support, 2 women from a startup fund Nina had connected me with. They shook my hand, congratulated me, asked how I managed to revitalize an old company so quickly. I answered each question with calm confidence. At 9:56 a.m., Calvin's black SUV rolled into the gravel lot. I watched from the back corner of the tent, behind a privacy divider. I didn't want to confront him just yet. I wanted him to walk into the space, feel the air shift, read the sign, hear the murmurs of people discussing my company. He stepped out of the car, wearing a navy blazer and sunglasses. He was smiling, confident, charming, self-assured. I could practically hear the false narrative playing in his head. This must be some developer who wants to partner with me. Maybe they'll offer me a stake. He glanced up at the sign. He blinked, paused, his head tilted slightly like he was trying to remember something. Then came the frown. I watched as he walked toward the front of the tent, straight into the arms of confusion. He looked around for someone familiar, probably expecting to see a corporate manager or a municipal contact. Instead, he saw Miles. "Calvin," Miles said with a cordial nod. "Glad you could make it." "What's going on here?" Calvin asked, forced smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "This is my father's property." Miles raised an eyebrow. "Not anymore. The deed was transferred months ago. Didn't you get the notice from the county?" What?" Calvin scoffed. "Transferred to who?" Miles didn't answer. He simply stepped aside, and I stepped forward. My heels clicked on the plywood flooring like a countdown. Calm, certain. When Calvin saw me, the smirk vanished. He blinked. "Ava?" "Good morning," I said evenly, stopping just in front of him. "Welcome." His mouth opened, but no words came. Behind him, I could hear cameras clicking. The photographer, bless her timing, had captured his reaction perfectly. "I believe you got the invitation," I added. "You RSVP'd yes." What is this?" he stammered, voice tightening. "You don't own this. This is our family's—" "I do own it," I said, lifting my chin. "Grandpa signed the transfer months before he passed. All the legal documentation is in place. The land, the name, the assets. Monroe & Co. Holdings is mine. And today, we're presenting our first development plan to potential partners." "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. "No," I said, eyes steady. "I'm just getting started." He looked around, like someone would step in and say this was a prank. But no one did. No one rushed to defend him. No one came to save face. Instead, Miles turned to the crowd and took the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a proud smile, "it is my honor to introduce you to the CEO of Monroe & Company Holdings, Ava Monroe." The applause was polite, respectful, but in that moment, it thundered louder than any victory cheer I'd ever imagined. Calvin stood motionless. He had no seat reserved, no role to play, no title on the brochure. He wasn't even a footnote in the legacy he thought he owned. I walked past him, took the mic, and began my presentation. I spoke clearly, passionately about honoring my grandfather's values: community, resilience, integrity. I outlined our plans to transform the land into sustainable housing for working families. I talked about my journey from caregiver to founder, from invisibility to influence. I never mentioned Calvin by name. I didn't need to, because the truth was already louder than any revenge. He watched in silence. And when the presentation ended and the guests lined up to shake my hand, Calvin simply turned and walked away. No words, no goodbye, just the slow, stunned walk of a man who realized too late that the girl he thought he'd erased was now the woman who owned everything he stood on. Calvin didn't leave right away. No, he lingered. For a few moments after my speech ended and the applause faded into polite chatter, he stood at the back of the tent like someone who'd shown up to the wrong wedding but didn't want to admit it. His hands were clenched. His eyes kept darting between faces, searching for someone to explain this, undo it. But there was nothing to undo. The reality had landed. He was standing on land he no longer owned, at an event he wasn't invited to, surrounded by people who had just witnessed the truth. Ava Monroe, the girl he discarded, now sat at the helm of the family's future. He looked pale, like someone had pulled the floor out from beneath him. I watched him as I continued greeting guests, shaking hands, taking business cards. He kept trying to catch my eye, but I didn't flinch. I was done giving him the power of my attention. Let him watch. Let him feel what it's like to be the outsider. The crowd was filled with murmurs. A few people recognized Calvin. I caught fragments of whispers. Isn't that her uncle? Didn't he used to own this? I heard he kicked her out. She's the one running the company now? The narrative was unraveling, and not in his favor. Eventually, someone from a local development group approached him and said what everyone else was thinking. I thought you were heading this project. Calvin forced a smile, thin as paper. There's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, the man replied, glancing toward me. Looks like she's the one in charge. And then came the moment he didn't see coming. Miles walked over, holding a printed folder with a gold Monroe & Company Holdings logo on the front. He extended it to Calvin like it was a final statement. You'll want to read through this, Miles said firmly. All ownership records, development rights, zoning applications, and transfer of title documentation are inside. As of now, Monroe & Company Holdings holds all legal and financial responsibility for the property. You're no longer authorized to represent or pitch any project affiliated with this land. That was the end of it, the final nail. Calvin took the folder with a shaking hand. You can't do this. I didn't, Miles replied, tilting his head toward me. She did. Calvin turned to me one last time, desperation flickering in his eyes. Ava, this doesn't make sense. You didn't even know how to run a company. I've been managing real estate for years. You're not qualified to— I didn't need to be, I interrupted, my voice calm but razor sharp. I just needed to be the one who showed up. The one who stayed when you didn't. The one Grandpa trusted. He flinched at that, at the mention of the one man who could never defend me now, but had left the truth in paper and ink. You think this is revenge? He spat. No, I said, meeting his gaze. This is accountability. For a moment it looked like he might say more, that he might shout, blame, twist the story like he always had, but he didn't. Instead he turned, folder clutched in his fist, and walked away. His shoulders sagged, his pace slow. I watched as he got into his car and sat behind the wheel for a long time without turning the engine on. Maybe he was trying to figure out when it all started slipping away. Maybe he was realizing the inheritance he thought was a birthright was never truly his. Or maybe, finally, he saw me not as a burden, not as a girl in the way, but as the one person who had earned her place. Susan didn't show up to the event, but she called Calvin while he sat in that SUV. I know because his phone lit up and the name flashed across the dashboard screen. Susan Monroe. I couldn't hear what she said, but I could guess. Maybe she was asking why there were pictures of me in the paper the next day. standing with a city official under the banner of Monroe and Comey Holdings. Or maybe she was just asking, what happened to the future we were promised? Either way, Calvin didn't answer the call. He just stared at the steering wheel, as still as the grave he tried to bury me in. And while he sat in silence, the sound of my name being celebrated, cheered, discussed in potential partnerships, rose all around him like a song he didn't know the lyrics to anymore. That was the consequence. Not rage, not revenge, but being irrelevant to a legacy that no longer needed him. After the guests left and the tent had been taken down, I walked the property one last time. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the field where Grandpa and I used to pick wildflowers for Grandma's grave. The air smelled like pine and fresh soil. Everything was quiet now. No more applause, no more cameras, no more stares. Just me and the place that shaped who I became. And I realized this was what peace felt like. I had spent so long preparing for this moment, imagining the confrontation, the vindication, the drop in Calvin's face when he realized I'd risen from the ashes. And yes, it was satisfying. Yes, I took a breath of quiet pride when he walked away speechless. But that wasn't what truly mattered. What mattered was that I no longer needed his approval. For so long, I had been waiting for someone, anyone, to see me, to say I was enough, that I mattered. I had tried to earn my place through kindness, through sacrifice, through staying silent even when it hurt. I thought that if I just gave enough, they'd finally let me in. But what I learned, in the darkness of that car, in the back row of that library, in the silence of being alone, was this. I never had to earn my worth. I just had to stop giving it away. That realization didn't strike like lightning. It came slowly, like dawn. It bloomed through every sleepless night, every silent step I took toward building my future. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I didn't need to destroy Calvin to win. The real victory was within. It was the moment I stopped proving myself to people who never wanted to see me. It was choosing to lead without bitterness. It was learning to trust the woman in the mirror. I stood at the edge of the property, holding the deed in my hands, and for the first time in my life, I felt unburdened. Not because I now owned the land, not because I wore the title of CEO, but because I was no longer defined by the pain others gave me. I had let go of the resentment, of the need to explain myself, of the fantasy that Calvin would ever become the man I wanted him to be. He had shown me exactly who he was, and in doing so, he forced me to meet who I truly was. Strong, capable, unapologetic. Grandpa always told me that people don't get what they deserve, they get what they fight for. I used to think that meant clawing my way through life, battling everyone who doubted me. But now I understand. It means building even when no one watches. It means rising even when no one applauds. It means reclaiming your story from those who tried to write you out of it. This land, this moment, this peace, I didn't take it from Calvin. He gave it up when he slammed the door in my face. I simply chose not to stay outside. And in that choice, quiet, deliberate, free, I found everything I was looking for. Not revenge, not power, but dignity. And no one can take that from me again. A few days after the event, I received a message. It wasn't dramatic, no long email, no tearful apology, just a short, sterile text from an unknown number. Can we talk? Calvin. I stared at it for a long time, not out of confusion, but because I didn't feel what I expected to feel. No anger, no panic, no hunger for confrontation, just a strange, quiet stillness. For years, I'd imagined what it would be like if Calvin ever reached out, not to mock me, but to face what he'd done. I imagined myself rehearsing some grand speech, listing every wrong, holding him accountable point by point. But now, standing on the other side of everything, I realized I didn't need that moment, because the power had shifted. I was no longer the girl waiting for him to see me. I was seen, by my peers, by the community, by the very people who once believed his version of the story, and most importantly, by myself. Still, part of me felt something unexpected: pity. Calvin had lost more than a company that day. He had lost the illusion that entitlement equaled legacy, that blood alone made someone worthy of inheriting power. He had been left behind, not by force, but by evolution. So I didn't block the number. I didn't respond either. Instead, I asked Miles to forward a formal letter, one I had drafted weeks earlier, just in case. It read, "Dear Calvin, I received your message. I appreciate your willingness to talk, but there's nothing that needs explaining anymore. You made a choice the night you closed that door. And I made mine when I decided not to knock again. I don't hold hatred toward you, but I also don't owe you access to the person I've become. If there's anything you'd like to discuss regarding property transitions or remaining documents, please forward them through legal counsel. Wishing you peace. Ava Monroe." No drama, no bitterness, just truth. Because closure, I learned, doesn't come from someone else admitting they were wrong. It comes from finally being at peace with the fact that they never will. About a week later, I got another message. This time from Ella, Calvin's daughter. She had just started college. Her message was thoughtful, unsure. She said she heard everything that happened and wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner, even though she'd been too young to fully understand. She asked if I was open to meeting for coffee. She said she wanted to learn more about her grandfather, my grandfather, and what he was really like outside the stories Calvin used to tell. That message did hit me, and I said yes, because the sins of the father don't always belong to the child. We met at a small cafe near campus. She looked nervous but hopeful, and as we sat down, I realized something else. This was what healing looked like. Not people begging for forgiveness, but people learning, genuinely, humbly, with curiosity instead of pride. Ella asked about the fishing trips, the stories Grandpa used to tell, the way he smiled when she was born. She told me she remembered me reading to her as a kid, how I smelled like cinnamon in books. And I told her the truth. Not just the good parts, not just the hurt, but everything in between. By the time we left, she hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you." It was small, but it was real. And it reminded me that some doors, once slammed shut, stay closed for good. But others can quietly open again when the right person knocks. And I wasn't afraid to open them anymore. Not because I needed to be saved, but because now I knew exactly who I was letting in. Today, I wake up in a space I own. Every brick, every beam, every key. It's not a mansion. It's not a palace. It's something better. It's mine. The apartment I live in now overlooks a stretch of the town I once drifted through like a ghost. I used to pass these buildings wondering if I'd ever belong. Now, I sign the papers that shape their future. I sit at the head of the table I was once kept away from. I walk into rooms where no one has to explain who I am anymore. They know. My business, Monroe & Company Holdings, is thriving. We've broken ground on our first housing development, with a focus on affordable homes for single mothers, young professionals, and veterans, the kind of people who, like me, were once told they didn't belong. Every blueprint we lay, every wall we raise, is rooted in the legacy Grandpa wanted, not in greed, but in grace, not in status, but in service. I see his photo every morning on my desk, not the stiff, posed one from his funeral, but the one where he's laughing on the back porch with his old army cap tilted sideways. That's the man who believed in me when no one else did. And sometimes, I talk to him, not out loud, just quietly, inside. I tell him, we did it. And I think he hears me. I don't speak Calvin's name anymore, not out of spite, but because I've outgrown the version of myself that needed to. He exists in the rearview mirror now, a reminder, a lesson, a closed chapter in a book I'm still writing. What he did, the betrayal, the door slammed in my face, was real. But so was my choice to rise from it. I didn't get here through revenge. I didn't build this out of rage. I built it because I deserved to. Because I finally stopped waiting to be invited in and started owning my space. I mentor girls now, women trying to start their first businesses, survivors of loss, of rejection, of being underestimated. I tell them the truth. That strength doesn't always come with shouting. That power is quiet, steady, and often invisible at first. And that the most dangerous thing you can ever become is sure of your own worth. Sometimes I drive past Grandpa's old house. Calvin doesn't live there anymore. He sold it and moved out of state after the failed investment deal. I don't know where he went. I don't ask. That door, literal and symbolic, is closed for good. But I do pause by the curb sometimes. I sit for a minute and remember the girl in the car, the one who cried herself to sleep behind the wheel, stomach growling, heart shattered, thinking the world had forgotten her. And I wish I could go back and whisper to her, "Don't break. You're not finished. This pain, it's the beginning, not the end." And then I drive away, stronger, taller, quieter in the best way. Because I don't live in anyone's shadow anymore. I don't need to prove my worth. I am the proof. And the most powerful story I'll ever tell is the one I lived.